Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. As you may know, food insecurity is an ever-growing problem in Canada. Over 15% of households reported struggling with putting food, especially healthy food, on the table. That's almost 6 million people in Canada, including 1.4 million children. On this show, we've looked at the big grocers and the role they play in our food supply. These massive companies, driven by profit and not the well-being of our communities, they get to decide what will be available to us and how much it'll cost. And at the same time, there are other large corporations out there really messing with the agricultural end of our food chain, determining what farmers grow and how. That's what we're going to look at today. I mean, much of what we're growing in Canada, we don't even eat. Now, I know no one listening to this show is going to be surprised that big business don't have our best interest at heart, or that their drive for profit often conflicts with what's best for us. We even hit on the issue of sprawl and depleting farmlands in our discussion on Ontario's greenbelts. But it turns out that is just a fraction of what is going on. I know this because I stumbled across a creator on TikTok who was flagging all sorts of alarming trends in the Canadian farming industry. So I called her into the studio to hear more about the aging farming population, something called monocropping, GMO seeds, and the steady monopolization of the industry into the hands of the fewer and fewer who can afford it. Ashley, or Queen of the Herd 613 as she's known on that platform, is a self-proclaimed newbie farmer, a socialist who wanted to find a model of farming that could resist the pressures of this corporatization of agriculture, contribute to the community, and support her family all at the same time. This hasn't proven easy, and she'll explain why that is by design. Well, welcome to the show, Ashley. Can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, sure. My name is Ashley. My last name is Ladouceur. Well, if you're French, you call it Ladouceur, but Ladouceur is the Anglified version of my last name. But I am a newbie farmer. My husband and I bought a farm in July 2021. This is kind of our passion project. Yeah, I do this most of my time.
You were telling me when I spoke to you earlier, you didn't have any experience in farming. And I won't lie, I've dreamed of owning a farm. Santiago talks endlessly about the entire commune experience. So he's game, but you took that step. Why? What made you get into farming?
It's always been like a childhood dream of mine. My mom's family are immigrants from Italy, and they grew up on the farm. And so I always grew up with my grandmother telling us about the farm and their life on the farm, and it just always seemed resonated with me. And then we lived rurally for about 10 years before we bought this farm, and we owned chickens, just chickens. And so it was kind of the gateway into I really like doing this.
Chickens are the gateway drug to nonprofit farming.
I've heard that before.
Chickens are literally the gateway animal. So we had chickens, and then we decided that I decided that I really wanted a farm, and my husband was on board. So we sold our house and we bought this farm. That's kind of it. I don't know. It was just in my DNA, I suppose. Is kind of how it comes from. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Italian DNA.
You're a not-for-profit farm.
Right.
There's some ideological drivers behind that, or?
Yeah.
You want to share?
Yeah.
I'm leading you here, clearly.
Yeah, so we're a not-for-profit farm. So our goal really, when we first envisioned this farm, what we wanted to do is create a system that could sustain, us living here. So, to make money for us to afford our mortgage and stuff like that. But that we didn't want it to be anything that was any money that we were making was going to go right back into the farm. And we have all kinds of visions for community programming. We really want this to be kind of like a safe place for people to come and experience farming and agriculture. Like, so we've always kind of envisioned this being just like some place that people can experience agriculture. I don't know. It's like, it's hard to, like, I didn't have access to this when I was a kid, and my husband didn't have access to this as a kid, and these are both things that we really would have loved to have access to. It was just kind of like, we are both very, like, involved in charity work, too. So, like, I also am the chair of, a dog rescue here in Ottawa. And so it's always just kind of been our nature to do things that are more charitable based. And when we started this farm, we wanted it to not be something that we were, like, doing as like for profit. We wanted to do it like as something that was good for, a large amount of people. And so not for profit kind of fit what we were looking to do. It also gave us access to better, like, to resources like grants, as well as like partnerships and things like that with other members that we might not have access to if we were for profit, which is more so what we were wanting to do, like access to Indigenous communities. They do like consultation for food forestry. We're also working with like the South Nation Conservancy, which owns a bunch of land around us. So because we're not for profit, we have a lot more opportunity to collaborate. So those were kind of a lot of the factors that weighed in to our decision. It was just kind of like what we naturally gravitated towards when we decided we wanted to build this farm into something.
That sounds really interesting. It's so different than, I guess, what the culture around agriculture is right now. And it sounds more like maybe what it used to be a bit closer to, more connected to the community. You mentioned like you have an Italian background. I grew up in an Italian neighborhood where like everybody has farms in their backyards, and people come together to cook the giant bats of tomato sauce around this time of the year, actually.
Yeah.
And even like in Italy, I know that there's way more of a culture of like worker cooperatives when it comes to farms, and that's something that used to be more of a thing in Canada. Now it's all but forgotten, it seems. But that idea of it being a welcoming space, that really resonated with me. It's something I definitely would have appreciated. And it seems, like that stands in such contrast to the current culture, right? I guess, like, what has been your experience with like that other culture, and like have people been welcoming of this idea?
So we really have been like, the farmers that we've like made friends with and like been working with have all kind of been small scale farmers. There's not really access to like these large scale corporations, because in almost every case they are corporations that own a huge swaths of the farmland in Canada. So it's been mostly just like people who like own a small farm, like the guy that we get our hay from, like he lives up the street from us, and like, we help each other out. And like, there's a farm across the street from him that does like small permaculture, and, we help each other out. So like, there's like a definitely a sense of community, more so driven by like need and like the need for support and shared like common experience. But it is not necessarily something that is like accessible unless you really look for it. Like, it's not like people are out there being like, hey, let's have like a farm meetup or whatever. Like, you really have to look pretty hard to find someone who, like, to find connections. And so that's what we've been doing. And so whenever we like have a need, or we need to source something, like we need to source straw or hay, or we need to source, like, we were looking for, even if like buying livestock and things like that, all of our connections with farmers have been made organically and like as a need, like, okay, we don't want to just buy something from you. We want to like get to know you and like have let's talk and let's see like how can we help each other out. But that's really the only way you can make connections. Otherwise, the community, the agriculture community, like people who are doing large scale agriculture is incredibly cut off. Like there's no access to it unless you are also a large scale producer. So that's our experience with it. There are some small farms, but like it's certainly not the majority of farms. And you have to live in a farming community. We live in a farming community. So like there are like small farms, but like if you lived somewhere where there wasn't a lot of small farms, like your access might be not that great. I don't know. It's a mixed bag.
Actually, I found you on TikTok because, obviously you're on political TikTok, or I wouldn't have found you. Also could be I'm a farmer with ADHD that ended up in my algorithm. But either way,
yeah.
I found you and I learned so much. Honestly, I think
thanks.
within like 9 minutes worth of videos, I got a much clearer picture of the agriculture industry across Canada. There were some facts there that, will work into the discussion, but you also highlighted some alarming trends. A couple that you kept coming back to that we are definitely going to have to hit in this discussion, but on top of the corporatization of agriculture, there's a real aging population of farmers that kind of couples into this buyout of farms,
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Yes. So the average age, so this was from like the census in 2016 and 2020, and the average age of the farmer, Canadian farmer, has like grown exponentially. So now average age of a farmer is 58 years old. In 2016, it was like 55. In 2020, it was 58. So you know that like there's not new people coming into this industry, right? They're just aging out. And so over half of all farmers are over the age of 55. And then the other half is split between people who are between 35 and 55. And there's only like 8% of farmers who are under the age of 35. So you have this mass exodus of farmers leaving the industry. And like the way our agriculture system is set up is that like when the quota system, so we have something called the quota system. It's market management, so or supply management. So basically the government was like, in order to keep certain commodities, the prices of certain commodities high, we're only going to allow a certain amount of it to enter into the supply chain. So like milk, for example, dairy. The quota system for dairy, originally when it was given out in the 1960s, it was given out for free. So if you had a dairy farm, you got a free quota. But because it's a finite resource, now those quotas are like worth, one cow will cost you $24,000. So like, if you want to sell milk just from one cow, it's $24,000. So, I mean, you're not going to be profitable or you're not going to be able to survive on just one cow. So most dairy farms have a minimum of 85 cows. Like you're looking at millions of dollars just for your quota. So what's happening is that these farmers who are old now and are like getting out of the industry, if they don't will or like pass their quota system onto like a direct family member, because that's the only way you can get through it without having to like sell it off, they sell it. And so they might be sitting on a quota for, 200 cows. That's millions of dollars. So then they sell that. But who's going to buy it? A 35-year-old's going to buy it? No. Like the only people who can afford to buy it are going to be major corporations, right? It's only going to be either these investment groups who buy it. And then what they do is they buy it and then they lease the property or the land back to farmers. Or they don't even do that. They just hire temporary foreign workers to come in and manage the farm. So it's like, we are seeing the complete degradation of this family-owned farm. And they get away with saying it's family-owned because the land is owned by corporations, but they might lease the land back to farmers, right? So then farmers are still farming the land, local farmers, but they don't own the land. So there's it's very convoluted, the whole idea, and I don't actually know if we have a real genuine picture of what the Canadian agriculture landscape looks like currently, based on who owns what. That information isn't always available. Like who actually owns the land that's being farmed right now? Is it the farmers? Is it corporations? Investors? I don't know. So there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of, I think people are not really fully grasping, like once these farmers who are now 58, the majority of them 58, once these farmers leave the industry, and it's not their kids taking over, because the statistics also tell us that 44% of all farmers don't use farming as their primary income, right? They do have a second job, or they have a full-time job. Just like my husband and I, we have full-time jobs. We don't use this as our primary income. And so
that's
they're not going to
unimaginable,
take
Like Santiago, can you... Yeah. We talk about how hard farming is. I think everyone would acknowledge that, like, that's the epitome of a hard worker, right? A farmer wakes up early, goes to bed late, works all day, and then has a 9-to-5 job that they try to cram in as well, just because it's just impossible for a small farmer now. There's a few trends, and they all equal just this capital ownership over our food supply that's pushing farmers like Ashley out?
Honestly, I do not know how any, like we're doing small scale. We chose, so like our main like products, our main like inventory are animals, but we've chosen animals that don't have a quota system. So we have like alpacas and sheep. Sheep don't have a quota system, and neither do alpacas. So you can like sell things like sheep milk if you wanted to. Not that I want to milk my sheep, but you could sell sheep milk if you wanted to. But wool, right? There's no quota system for wool. So you have access to fiber. Same thing with alpacas. You can access their fiber. But like,
underrated
if
fiber.
you want to, yeah, exactly, right? And like we do everything here ourselves, because if we outsourced our wool, like shearing, like having our sheep sheared, I shear my own sheep. If we outsourced our wool production, our wool like processing, I process my own wool. Like it would not be worth it. Like it would cost you so much money. You wouldn't make anything off of it. So we do everything here, which is labor intensive, but at least we do everything here. But like if you're somebody who doesn't have the same skill set that like maybe I do, or the same support network, because I'm very lucky. We have, there's myself, my husband, my parents live really close by. They help with a lot of stuff. And then we have friends who are like always willing to come help. One of my friends, a vet tech, like I have veterinarian friends. Like we have a very, very solid network. But if we didn't have that, I have no idea how you'd get into this or survive doing this in any kind of meaningful way. So.
I don't think you're not supposed to have that, though. That was one of Santiago's points. It's farming only really works as a cooperative. All societies do. Those are optimal conditions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like, it really does need to be like a cooperative. You have to have buy-in from like people in your community to want to do it. But I don't think that in this climate there is a lot of buy-in like for other people, like we have a good community, a good network that we've built over the years, with our friends and family and stuff, but I don't necessarily know that exists outside of like what we do, because like our farmer friends, like sometimes we're their only other farming friend. It's kind of like, oh, okay, like not everybody wants to make those connections. So I don't know, there's no safety nets really for people getting into farming or getting into agriculture in general, unless you're a corporation. Obviously, then the government will bail you out, so it doesn't matter.
Can't help but just be so angry at like how this connects to all the other aspects of food and culture in our society, right? Because it's like, okay, so the actual farmers are struggling, aging, not being able to find young people who want to do it. It's incredibly difficult to get into. And then these massive corporations are taking over everything as massive corporations do. And then on the other end of it, when it comes to the consumer side, food is too expensive. Food insecurity is massive. Yet we live in a country that has so much farmland. We live in the second largest country in the world. We have so much opportunity to feed everyone. And yet we're struggling so much. And this really is just such an indictment of capitalism and capitalist culture.
I think one of the biggest issues that we have is the way in which we farm, right? Like the only method that governments have incentivized over the last 20, 30 years is like this like cash cropping, right? So monoculture, like this cash cropping, where they only want you to produce certain things. They only want you to produce like wheat, and grains, and they only want you to produce corn, and they only want you to produce soy. And there's no diversity in what we produce. But when you grow those things all the time in the same fields, all the same plant, the soil erosion, so all the soil that once was arable farmland, once was healthy soil, completely dissolves, right? Like you can erode soil to nothing in 1 year. But to rebuild it takes decades. What they have done is essentially they've made it impossible for you to grow anything on these lands that are growing cash crops other than cash crops. And they are, that's the only thing that you will make money off of. So if you're farming and you want to make money off of farming, you literally have to grow one of those crops. There's really no other incentivized programming. They have like, crop insurance, and then there's like, the grain boards. So just like dairy, if you grow grain, you cannot just sell your grain to a mill. Like you have to go through a grain board or a grain marketing board, and that grain marketing board has a quota system in itself, and they will purchase grain from suppliers, so from farmers, and that's how you get paid. you don't get to go directly to like a mill or to like, you know, General Mills or someone who might buy a lot of grain, right? Or to animal feed, right? You already, like, there's so many levels of interruption when, like, as a farmer, you have such limited access to actually getting your food out. But that's why it's incentivized, because there are also, you know, safeguards in that system that, like, if you have a really crappy crop one year, well, it's okay because your corn can just go to make ethanol gas. Doesn't matter.
Cow feed.
Or, yeah, exactly, or cow feed, right? It doesn't matter. So there's a lot more safeguards in that system, but what they've done is that they've turned a whole bunch of like potential land that could be grown using like actually growing, you know, food for consumption into just garbage soil. Like you can't grow anything. You can't grow like healthy crops on that type of soil, right? Because your soil is also...
But you can grow their GMO seeds, right? Isn't that the point?
Yeah, you can grow their GMO seeds because they are literally designed to grow in crappy soil. Designed to grow so that if you don't have a lot of water, your soil, you don't have a lot of nutrients in the grain. Doesn't matter. They're designed that way.
When I look at that, though, it makes me so mad because it's like even when the corporation doesn't own the farm, it's beholden to corporate and capital in so many ways, right? Through sometimes the market boards and how they operate, but what seeds they're using, it's...
Yeah, they're proprietary. Yeah. So, like, it's illegal for a farmer to reuse seeds. But, like, the seeds are designed so that you can't harvest seeds from, like, a GMO corn and then plant them. They won't grow. That's what they're designed to do.
Fuck?
That's why, like, when people
So you have to go back and buy the seeds.
100% every single year. Yeah. And that's why people, when talk about, like, the difference between, like, organic seeds or heritage seeds and GMO seeds, you cannot harvest seeds from GMO crops or GMO plants and then replant them.
That makes me so mad.
So
like I'm
messed
just
up.
steam is coming out, and I can see Santiago's face warping there for those that are just listening in.
Yeah, heritage. You have to buy heritage seeds. Yeah, and so that whole system is designed specifically to keep farmers always in the negative, and that's exactly what happens. They borrow a boatload of money every year to buy the seeds, which cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then they also have to buy the fertilizer, usually from the same company, for possibly, you know, also hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then they have to buy the pesticides and the herbicides, all from the same company because they service the seed, right? Like they build everything for the seed. So you all buy it, and then you have to borrow that money because you don't have that money up front because it's literally millions of dollars. And then you hope that you have a good crop, and then you just pay back your loan and you borrow again. They're always stuck in a negative cycle. Always.
Someone needs to explain to me how we're not still living under feudalism, because it just sounds like...
We are.
It is.
We are.
It is.
And
Yes,
so
it is.
under these conditions, and a few more, but these economic conditions, it's no wonder that there's so many farmers that have their retirement plan set around selling to developers. Like one of the biggest pushbacks to the Greenbelt Act during its inception was from farmers who, you know, blockaded roads, Santiago, highways, to say you're killing our retirement plan. Our children don't want these farms. They see how hard it is, and we need to be able to pay everything off. Like you can't cut us off from selling to the top bidder. And so, you know, you can't really fault farmers for that when they're put in these tight economic situations, even though you're just like, you can't sell our farmland. But the reality is, you know, I'm looking at from 1996 to 2006, Ontario, which Ashley shared with me. Ontario has 25% of Canada's farms. And between the 10 years that I mentioned there, we lost 175 acres a day, which sounds like really bad, right? Really bad. But since then, right now, the most recent report is we're now losing 318 acres of farmland a day in Ontario. So I don't know if you two want to work out what that's going to mean for our food insecurity and security. Where are we going to get our food from, and what's it going to cost? If we're driving, the only people that will hold farmland are using GMO seeds and have almost complete control over the cost of our food. It's not just Galen Weston fixing our bread prices.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's everybody. It really is. Yeah. I mean, we import 70% of all the produce that we eat here in Canada. Like, we import it all from...
Do we have to? Like I know we can't grow maybe certain...
We don't have...
Well, Santiago's going to tell me we can grow absolutely anything. I know that.
Yeah.
I know that. So I'll stand corrected.
We absolutely can. Yeah. I mean, we don't have to. So the indigenous people have been growing food here for centuries, right? They know exactly what they're doing. But conventional farming is designed for a certain type of farming. But we could build food forests. We absolutely could build food forests. It would change what we eat. Like, we can't grow necessarily, avocados here and, peaches and stuff. Like, we'd have to change our diet a bit, but it wouldn't be any less healthy. It wouldn't be any less delicious. It would just be the way we think about food, right?
Yeah, a couple days ago, we were just actually talking about that because I was saying about how a big issue in Canada is around the culture of our food, right? We expect things to be available at any time of the year. And we don't really have an identity around what we eat at all. Most people haven't really been taught even how to cook for themselves meals from scratch, everything.
Especially in season, right?
Yeah. Like I was saying about how, like, for example, squash is like one of those crops that has been very important in Canada forever. And we don't have any meals that people eat regularly that are based around squash. I cook like a really good squash curry that I'm a big fan of. Why are we not like using these ingredients that are traditional ingredients of the land, right? And that's the issue. Like, we haven't made an effort at all to have any cultural identity around our food. Like places like Thailand, I was using as an example, pad thai. The Thai government invented pad thai as their national dish so that they could have something like that. Most culinary in like places like Italy is actually quite modern. It's from the last 100 years. All the dishes that we know and we think of when we think of Italy, that's from the last 100 years, And so it's like there's been no effort to create that culture, and so we're relying on all these all of these imports of all of these things because what else do we know? That's the only thing that we know, right?
I remember my grandmother my grandmother's passed away, but when she would tell us about like what she would eat, like when she was a kid, and they didn't have refrigeration, so like every day they would make their own bread, they would like literally make their own cheese, they would make foods that they could cure and preserve and stuff. So like they knew exactly what they had and what they could make out of it to sustain themselves. And that's certainly not anything that people know anything about now. Like, people don't know like how to do basic food preservation. You can capture food that you grow in your garden and save it, and preserve it by canning or dehydrating or freeze drying, whatever you want to do. But that skill set is like, it's like a lost art, right? Like, people don't want to know it. People don't want to like invest their time and energy into it. And so I think part of the problem is that like we have a short growing season, right?
Summer's like a week.
Yeah, exactly. Like you might get like August, you might get like April to like, if you have like, good infrastructure, you might have from like April to like October. So we have a short growing season. But if you can preserve and capture that food that you grow, right, you can feed yourself all year round. But it's really a huge change in mindset in that like understanding what we have available, how to preserve it, and then what you can make from it, and like being okay with eating different types of food. Even like food foraging, right? Like there are so many edible plants that we consider weeds, like so many. And so you could just, understanding like you can go out into like, the forest or like just a local area of heck, like this side of the road has all these weeds growing on it. And a lot of those plants are edible. But yeah, it's just like people want to eat the same things and they don't want to really learn, or they don't have the ability to learn or the access to the knowledge to learn how to like be self-sufficient when it comes to food.
An example that comes to mind of what you're saying is I mentioned earlier, like the tomato sauce, right?
You jar that for a whole year.
Yeah, like I've seen like the giant bats. You buy all the tomatoes in season, you make like hundreds and hundreds of jars, keep it in the cantinas, and it feeds multiple families, large families, for the entire year. It takes one day. It takes one day to do that. And you're set for the year. And that's so, I can't speak to how much infinitely better that is than like a jar of classical sauce at the grocery store, you know? And it's so much more nutritious too.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a frustrating part. Like you say that like people don't want this. I think a lot of people do want this. It's just, where do you get this? Especially like I myself, I'm living, like I'm in downtown Toronto, where it's in the city, we just don't have access to food and nature in that same way. And because of that, it's got me thinking a lot about what are our options in terms of building more of a connection between people and their food. And one thing that comes up a lot is the idea of greenhouses and vertical greenhouses and some like modern technologies, especially with what you're saying about the soil
and the availability of avocados.
Yeah.
Soilless agriculture is becoming more of a thing. What do you think of like, is that kind of like, I know a lot of people debate whether or not technology got us in this mess. Is it going to get us out? Is modern agriculture techniques, is that a potential solution here?
Yeah, I mean, hydroponics are pretty popular in the like homesteading, farmsteading community. But the only thing with hydroponics is that you can't grow, like it's great for like a small, like a family. You're not gonna be able to feed like a lot of people with hydroponics. So it's great for the individual, absolutely. But when you're talking about like feeding a country or feeding like a lot of people, it's just not, you do definitely need like land for that. But yeah, I mean, I don't see how it's any less nutritious. I mean, the only thing is that like a lot of the nutrients that we get in our food does come from the soil. So I think hydroponics probably uses like fertilizers and things like that make it more nutrient rich. But I do know several people who use like hydroponics and they've been very happy with it. You're also kind of limited to what you can grow in hydroponics, but yeah, I mean, we've definitely thought of it here. There is like an incredible facility. They have a YouTube channel. They're like, I think they're on TikTok, but I'm not sure. They are called Arcopia. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're in Saskatchewan, and they have a passive solar greenhouse. And they grow everything from like fruits and vegetables, but they recently grew bananas this year in their greenhouse, which is like an incredible feat. Like they're in Saskatchewan, and so they have they have this incredible system, and they've been sharing their information. But that I think is like kind of, you know, the future if we really want to get into like extending our growing season and growing nutritious food here. I think that's kind of the future of where we need to go. And it's, you know, it's got technology in it, but it's also it's all passive. So he uses like rainwater to water his, you know, to bring the water in. He uses fish to clean the water and everything. And then the water that the fish poop in, he uses as fertilizer. So it's incredible production.
Almost like a real ecosystem.
Oh yeah, it's incredible. And even like he had a video, it was like -40 outside in the winter and the greenhouse was 24 degrees. Yeah. And he does nothing. He just has solar panels up.
So like between stories like that, farmers markets, hearing about your sheep farm and alpacas, some would think farm to table initiatives supporting their local small farmers may be a solution, you know, economically, socially, to get out there and buy locally. I saw you kind of hit on that in terms of that's great, you know, like building a connection, knowing where your food comes from, supporting local farmers. But if we're talking about a large scale solution to what is clearly a systemic problem, that's not going to cut it, is it?
No, definitely not. I mean, farm to table is great. Exactly. Like if you have connections and you can go and get farm to table, that's amazing. But like, yeah, it's not going to feed Canadians. It's not going to feed our population. And what we need is actually like large investment, large swaths of investment from, you know, governments at all levels, federal, provincial, and, you know, municipal governments into protecting all of our arable land and ensuring that it can never be developed on. But then also if you have people who want to leave the industry, that there are mechanisms for them to do so without, you know, having to, you know, be poor or whatever, right? Like there has to be some investment. And I think So the government in like the 1970s, they basically started downloading, or they decided that they didn't want to really fund or which is subsidize agriculture. So they started like downloading the cost of subsidizing agriculture to the consumer, which is why we have like so many market boards and quota systems and all that stuff. But that means that that the market boards are the ones who are in charge, right? These capitalist organizations are the ones who are in charge. And there's not been a real investment in agriculture since like after the Second World War. Actually, probably during the Second World War, but after the Second World War, right? They've been divesting.
Sounds like public housing.
Right, they've been divesting, right? They've been trying to get it off, and like that's the problem of the capitalists. The corporations can deal with it. But you're talking about food, right? You're talking about things that everybody needs. Yeah.
That's a series of its own. That's the problem with capitalists.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You told an interesting story I wanted to repeat here a little bit in terms of the influence market boards have, and this ties into what Santiago was talking about, what kind of food we eat. When creating the Canada Food Guide, traditionally, I imagine market boards were used to being listened to, and so quite often it didn't maybe genuinely reflect what a human body should consume, but that was balanced with the needs of the economy, right? The needs of farmers to sell their product and their cash crops. And they received a little bit of pushback for once.
Yeah. So I used to work for Health Canada many years ago. And I specifically worked in the Food Directorate, which is like the regulating body for food safety in Canada. And at the time, they were redoing the food guide. And so, or the food guide and the food pyramid, you know? And so they were having like massive consultations. It was a whole thing. But in the past, the market boards and all of these like, you know, lobby groups were the ones who dictated what we ate, you know, how we ate. And I will caveat saying this, that the food guide is largely what impacts what food is accessible to Indigenous communities in remote areas. So they are intrinsically tied. So if the top of the food guide is like dairy and meat, they're going to have, that's what's going to be provided in abundance essentially to these Indigenous communities. And then like we had fruits and vegetables much lower, right? So it's all kind of one system. But the food guide was heavily influenced, if not designed, by lobby groups.
Like, was I naive thinking that wouldn't be politicized? Like I was.
Food is always political.
Obviously.
I want to mention a small anecdote here because a couple weeks ago I was up in Northern Ontario in the town of Sioux Lookout, and I was actually part of this workshop where we were talking about food, and the food guide came up, and some of the Indigenous community leaders there were saying about how, you know, there's no mention in these things about stuff like moose, you know, something that is a staple for them that they rely on, moose meat. No mention of stuff like moose meat, no mention of their traditional foods at all. And I mean, we mentioned like dairy, and like we know where that comes, like the dairy lobby in Canada is incredibly powerful. And we know that the effects that's had. I mean, I don't even know where to go with this because it's just like everything comes back to the same spot, which is this is all connected, and this is a giant systemic mess that needs to be completely scrapped, and we need to completely redesign what we're doing here, because I don't know how much longer can we really survive on this model. I mean, we spoke a little bit before we started recording about food insecurity in Canada. And I mean, it's worth reminding people that like we're in drastically dire situation when it comes to food insecurity. I mean, I don't even know what like, I don't even know what to ask, because it's just like, we're kind of screwed, aren't we? Like,
it's so complicated because there are so many stakeholders, like even within just like the federal landscape, like how many organizations within the federal government deal with agriculture. Like you have Agri-Food and Agri-Science, you have CF, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Health Canada, you have like your pesticides groups, you have Public Health Agency, You have then you have like market. There are like whole groups of like departments that are dedicated just to agriculture. Like there's the dairy farmers or Dairy Coalition of Canada, I think is where something like that. Grain Farmers of Canada or Grain Coalition of Canada. Anyway, those are like actual government institutions. There's like the Farm Credit Canada, which is like a credit union but sourced by the government. Like that's just agriculture, right? And then you have to think about like all the other players. Like you've got trade, international trade. You have the people working like global affairs, in like IRCC. So you've got immigration because you have temporary foreign workers coming in. There are so many players, and don't even get started on climate change, right? And then none of them talk to each other. Right, in any kind of...
None of them talk to us about...
Nobody...
Like, none of this. I love how our food and what is grown, none of it is determined by what we actually need for our bodies and...
Yeah, like there are...
To find balance with
the
earth.
There's literally... Like, and they don't talk to each other in any meaningful way. Like, they'll talk to each other, like, at high-level meetings or whatever, and they'll, like, share decks and stuff, like, between, like, just information between each other. But there's no meaningful collaboration except maybe with Canadian Food Inspection Agency and Health Canada. But, like, anyways, it's a complete mess. It's, like, and I think it's designed that way so that there's so many players that it's really hard to, like, get a handle on what's happening and who you should contact to be, like... upset about things. But like I did on my TikTok talk about like lobby groups, like how many agriculture lobby groups there are and how much time and energy they spend lobbying the government. And like
because that's what those market boards are.
They're just lobby groups.
They're lobbyist groups that also control the quota system.
Exactly. Yeah. That's their whole purpose, is just to lobby the government. And they will meet with government officials, like, and people who are coming into this industry too, like maybe working and making policies, drafting regulations, are not necessarily subject matter experts. So you might have like, somebody who's an executive who doesn't really understand the entire system, making policies and regulations. They're like being influenced by lobby groups. They're having all this influence and then making policies and regulations. It's so massive. It's like one of those things that you're just like, I don't know. You can't really start. I think like you really have to have like grassroots organizations that are like dedicated to education and to like doing what you can to like inform people and to like bring people into agriculture in a way that's accessible.
En masse though, right? Because at the same time we say, the local farmer, like with all due respect, actually your model like can't be the solution. No. It has to be a massive cooperative of like-minded people with access to land and like wealth in this country. We're just seeing that one figure that was just so staggering to me as well was that the number of farmers are decreasing while the size of farm is increasing. And with all the other trends that we've learned, we know that means one of the most valuable resources we have is our food is in smaller and smaller amount of people's hands. So that's again, we come back to one of those where it's systemic change that's needed, right? Regime change. Healthy farming, I don't think exists under capitalism.
No, I would 100% agree with that. Yeah, it's virtually impossible for, like, if you do this for profit, it would be virtually impossible for you to do it ethically, in my opinion. It's like you have to buy into the system. What we do, like we've invested literally everything, every penny that we have gets invested back into the farm. That's our choice and we're lucky enough that we're able to do that. If we didn't have full-time jobs and we didn't have there'd be no way we could survive doing this like full-time right now. I mean, our goal is to be able to like find a model that works in a way that we can stay pay our mortgage and stuff like that and do this full-time. That's our goal. But it's, but if you're a farmer who does this full time, I don't know, you have to kind of buy into this mass farming scheme.
Which brings in the discussion of, not that we're going to have here, but that we'll have likely next week. And we had on a rant about the use of migrant workers right? So when you say it can't be done ethically, that doesn't just mean the environment and food quality or economically, but also on the human perspective. And this is all sold and bought under the guise that this is the only way farms can really operate. And if we want to feed cities, then this is the only model that works. And surely we can find something else.
Yeah. I mean, there's like something to say for like automation, right? Like if they could work on something to make, because farming is labor intensive. It always is going to be labor intensive. But if you could find a way to make it easier for people, that would be amazing. But migrant workers have been ridiculously exploited.
It's also worth mentioning that since we import so much of the food that we actually eat, that we're also responsible for the exploitation of workers outside of Canada too. Workers who are making the food that we consume in countries that do not have the same labor laws that Canada has, which, for the record, I mean, not that Canada's labor laws are in any way adequate, because they're not. It just seems that we're so far removed from what we should be doing, and I can't help but think like of examples such as Italy, where cooperatives are so much more common, and where the food is also so much more nutritious. Like we know that the vegetables that are grown there are so much healthier than the vegetables we grow here, and that's a country that's a lot smaller than Canada and has a much larger population than Canada. It's not that the answers aren't out there, it's that this is the intentional and malicious decision of how we chose to structure our country and structure our economy. I don't even know what to ask today, Jessa, so if you have a question.
Well, no, I think like we've come to, the end of our discussion, but I think it was an important discussion to have, especially with Ashley here, to get that ground up perspective of how these trends in farming are playing into the food insecurity most of us are experiencing and that we've talked about on the show. So we've gone after Loblaws and the grocery stores and those capitalists for their price gouging, and we've talked about the impacts of food insecurity with Paul Taylor before, and why food banks are also not the solution. But it was interesting to see, and also devastating, I think, to hear from Ashley just how many trends are out there that nobody's really acting on all that much. The lobby groups that exist are not really advocating for food security, but for the well-being of the suppliers and the farmers. And although we need to look after farmers, we have to look after our food supply and our environment and our economy as well. So I learned a lot, Ashley, and I'll continue to. We'll drop your links in the show notes as well, back to your TikTok, so folks can get your Agriculture 101 there. More than we could possibly share here. But is there anything else that you wanted to share with the audience that, they need to know in terms of the agricultural industry and farming in Canada and how that plays into what they're likely paying at the grocery store?
Yeah. I mean, I think if we're all just more critical of our agriculture industry, and like, people are critical of the agriculture industry for a lot of reasons. Obviously, like there's, human exploitation and animal exploitation that exists within the industry. But there's also like, people are farmers are really just kind of stuck where they are because everything is so expensive to change and everything's so expensive to redo or to like absorb new systems or like invest in new systems. And so I think if you are a young person and you want to know a meaningful way to help farmers or to help, or help establish food security, is like get involved if you can, either in like, there are cooperatives similar to what we do that exist, kind of all over the place. So if you have the means to do so, like get involved, try to like, make ethical choices, not just based on like, is this animal being treated nicely, which is, an important aspect of our of farming, but also like, is this farm doing harm to the environment? And are they trying to make changes to make themselves better? I don't know. I don't know that there's any other major things that we can do as people right now, as citizens right now, until we really have like some meaningful changes from the folks who with all the power and control. It's hard when you're the little guy.
We could build barricades.
Yeah, perfect.
Barricades sound good.
I've got Highland cows. They've got they're like barricades themselves.
The visual.
Yeah, just tie them up.
I feel cover
nobody's gonna
artwork
cross them.
happening.
Yeah, that's it. Their names are Hagrid and Hamish, so they're very they suit their names.
That's awesome. Thank you, Ashley, for sharing your knowledge and your time with us
My
today.
pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It was nice talking to you.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Helou Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.